As a kid, I didn't know the job I have today was even a thing. I knew I wanted a job where I got to invent things and solve problems. In movies and on TV, those were the characters I connected with the most. While everyone wants to be James Bond, I recognized Q was the real hero of those stories. But what was that job? Not knowing any scientist, again, my only insights came from movies and TV, the best I could tell, those people were engineers. So when it was time to go to college, those were the programs I applied to. When I got to college and started taking different classes, I learned that engineers solve problems in the here and now, but there were other people working to figure out how the universe worked in the first place, so engineers, physicians, and veterinarians could do their jobs. I learned that as a scientist, I could be the Q for engineers and physicians, and that was all I needed to know. Once I found biology, I went knocking on doors of every faculty member I could, looking for an opportunity to get hands-on with what life science research is really all about. I was fortunate to end up in a lab with a great mentor. Most faculty recognize the role mentors have played in our lives and want to pay it forward. We want to help you be successful in life, not just in your classes. So don't be afraid to take advantage of that. People always ask me, how did this kid from the burbs end up with a PhD working on diseases of poultry? It was largely the advice I got from my undergrad mentors. They told me find a lab group that was as interested in my success and not just the project success. That turned out to be a lab working to discover new viruses associated with the turkey disease. And I've been studying viruses and how the body tries to fight them off ever since. I'm fascinated by how something 800 times smaller than the width of a human hair can shut down whole countries and kill more people than most wars. In 15 months, the 1918 influenza pandemic killed an estimated 675,000 in the US alone. That's more than all the US deaths from any of the wars the US has fought except the Civil War, and that only wins out if you count combat deaths from both sides. And in just a few months, we've seen the virus that causes COVID-19 kill over 120,000 people in the US, making it deadlier than all but the Civil War and World War II. And I have no doubt that our death toll would be much worse if we hadn't taken the actions we did to slow its spread. And while we blunted the impact of COVID-19, we're still not out of harm's way. If we let down our guard, it's still possible for this to be every bit as bad as the 1918 flu, or maybe even worse. But there's no excuse for us if this pandemic is worse than in 1918, because we understand this is a virus and we know how to track its spread. In 1918, we didn't know what was causing the disease. We didn't figure out that influenza was a virus until the 1930s. The field of virology, the study of viruses, is actually relatively new. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that people first started to realize there might be infectious things smaller than bacteria. But the tools of that age made this difficult to prove, so initial reports were thought to be more oddities and outliers. Today, we know viruses are not only common, they're one of the most abundant things on Earth. There are over 10 million viruses in every drop of seawater. So a shot glass of seawater contains as many viruses as there are people on Earth. Now, those viruses pose no risk to you. Actually, most viruses don't infect humans. There are viruses of bacteria, viruses of plants, viruses of animals. We've even found viruses that attack other viruses. Viruses survive by infecting cells, then hijacking that cell and forcing it to mass produce copies of itself. In fact, viruses are completely dependent on the cell they infect for their own survival. Viruses are so dependent on the infected cell, they aren't considered to be independent living things. Outside of an infected cell, they can't do anything. And so they don't meet the definition of biological life. So this not alive, completely dependent, but still evolving infectious agent, you would think that's got to be a tough way to make it in the world. There can't be too many ways that can happen, right? Actually, there are over 6,300 distinct named species of viruses. These named viruses are grouped into 168 different families based on their size, shape, based on different steps they take over the cell they infect, and based on the type of physical shell they use to protect their genes from the environment. 168 families, along with a growing list of viruses that don't fit into any of those groups, means there are over 168 different ways viruses can look and behave. Essentially, any combination of viral traits you can think of, there's a virus in nature right now filling that niche. In spite of all that diversity, and no matter what type of cell it infects, all viruses essentially have to go through the same basic process. Starting off outside the cell as a free virus, It first has to find the type of cell it can infect. Viruses are generally very specific, not only to what kind of organism they infect, but even the specific cells within that organism. When a virus bounces into the right cell in the right way that allows for the protein receptor on the surface of the virus to bind to a specific protein on the surface of the cell, this kickstarts the virus's life cycle. After it's bound to its new victim cell, the virus has to get inside the cell. Once inside the cell, it removes its protective coat and releases its genes, starting the process of hijacking the cell. It uses the cell's machinery to first make viral proteins that help ensure it has total control of its victim, and then it starts making thousands of copies of its genome and coat proteins that will then be assembled into new viruses. Those daughter viruses are then released from the cell and go off to infect other cells. So pause to think about this. The virus takes over its host cell, forces it to make thousands of new viruses, then spills out into other cells. This is insidious, amazing biology. There are so many viruses that it's happening in virtually every plant or every animal every day. Viruses do all of this without intent, malice, or kindness. Much like a computer virus released on the world, they've been programmed to infiltrate vulnerable systems, execute their code, replicate, and repeat. For some viruses, probably a minority, the infection process disrupts the cell they're in so much that those cells die, and that damage leads to disease for the infected plant or animal. In other cases, viruses infect, replicate, and spread completely unnoticed by the host and don't cause any disease. We actually know very little about these viruses, most of whom we've only recently developed the tools to even know they exist. There are hundreds of different ways that viruses can take over a host, and viruses have had hundreds of millions of years of evolution to try those ways out. There are more than 1 million viruses out there yet to be discovered. Why do some cause disease and others not? That's one of the major questions of the field of virology, and one that my lab is working on.